and I would like to introduce Dr. Karen Rain. She leads the University of Maryland Plant Diagnostic Lab, which is a wonderful resource here in Maryland. A lot of states don't have something like this, and I'm going to let her talk about it mostly, but it's a wonderful place where farmers and green industry professionals in Maryland can send samples of plant problems that they're having and get those problems diagnosed, which is amazing. So Dr. Rain, would you like to introduce yourself as well and get going?
Sure. Thank you, Nia. I'm Karen Rain, and I am a plant pathologist by training, but I've also been a diagnostician, plant diagnostician for, gosh, maybe over 30 years now. And as a diagnostician, you become a generalist. As Nia said, I run the University of Maryland Plant Diagnostic Lab, which is on campus at College Park. And before I came to Maryland, maybe it's been about 13 years now, 12 or 13 years. I had the same position at Purdue University. So I got my share of corn and soybeans, as Alan mentioned earlier. But here in Maryland, it's quite a diverse group of crops to deal with in the clinic. So it's been a lot of fun. And Nia asked me to speak today about disease and pest issues for hydroponic greenhouse growers. And a lot of what I'm going to say isn't restricted to hydroponics. So hopefully, even if you're not a hydroponic grower, you'll still find some information that's useful about pests and diseases in whatever crops you are growing and whatever system that you're using. We can kind of group the factors that cause problems in hydroponics or any kind of controlled environment agriculture into a couple of different broad categories. And the first category are the abiotic or the non-living issues that can affect plant growth. These are things like nutrient availability, fertilizers, rates, and so forth, and water quality issues. That's one kind of broad group of issues that can cause problems in plants. And the environmental factors, things like temperature, humidity, and not just temperature of the air, but temperature of whatever medium you're growing in, be it hydroponic liquid or rock wool or soilless mix or whatever. It's another group of factors that affect plant growth and can really have an impact on your crop. But we also have those biotic issues. And as a plant pathologist, the ones that are near and dear to my heart are the plant diseases. Those are the problems that are caused by microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, and viruses. And we also have the arthropod group of arthropods like insects and mites that can cause problems. And those two groups combined make those biotic or living issues that cause problems affecting greenhouse crops and any crop really. And when you're doing troubleshooting and diagnosis, you've got to kind of sort out everything. You know, there's within each one of those categories, there's a lot of specific factors within those. So if you're really working on trying to diagnose a problem in your crop, you've got to sort all of this out. And it can be a daunting task. So I kind of distill the process into steps that you can just mentally do to maybe help narrow down the possibility of what's happening. First is you really need to know your crop. You need to know what the growth requirements are for optimum growth. You need to, and if you know that and you know what the crop is, you also narrow down the list of possibilities of things like diseases and insect pests. You can look there and see what factors might be, you know, instead of looking at the huge list of all the pests and diseases that can occur on every crop. When you know what the crop is, you can narrow that list down significantly. Let's see. The next step in doing diagnostics is to look for the symptoms and the signs. Symptoms are the way a plant responds to one of these irritants. So you see things like spotting on leaves. You might see overall yellowing or what we call chlorosis. You might see wilting. You might see some discoloration or rotting in the roots. And symptoms are basically the way that plant responds to one of those causal agents. Sometimes symptoms can be diagnostic, but oftentimes they're not specific enough to tell you what particular causal agent there might be. So we also want to look closer and look for signs, and that's the actual physical evidence of a plant pest or a plant disease. Things like insect skins, the actual insects themselves, any kind of webbing or frass they might produce, fungal growth, that fuzzy white growth that you might see, sometimes sporulation you can see. So if you're trying to troubleshoot, you're going to look for both the symptoms and the signs to help maybe give you clues as to what the problem might be. You also want to look at the patterns, how the symptoms are developing over time, because patterns can tell you a lot. Abiotic or non-infectious problems usually occur in more uniform patterns. If you think about weather-related problems like a late spring frost outdoors, anything that's got soft, tender new growth will show that damage, so it's more uniform. The insects and diseases tend to be more random in their distribution, and so you might see individual random spots on a leaf developing, you know, and spreading within the plant as well as plant to the plants nearby. You'll see that spread over time that you don't always see with abiotic issues. Again, so you're looking for the pattern, and you're looking for the symptom pattern across the whole planting, the greenhouse, the bench, the bed, the field, whatever. And you also want to look at the symptom development on an individual plant. Is it the entire plant, or is it just a certain portion? Is it random leaves that are affected, or is it all of the leaves? So those kinds of ways of looking at symptoms can really help give more clues to what the causal agents might be. And finally, you want to investigate the environmental and cultural practices that may surround or may have induced the kinds of symptoms that you're seeing. Very often we see symptoms after a particular activity or event. Maybe the fertilizer injector broke, and so you start seeing a pale green coloration in the crop because you're not getting the fertilizer that you thought you were to the plants, to the crop. And you can run some analyses that sort of should be your go-to, particularly with hydroponic growing, and that's the nutritional analysis of the water or the nutrient solution to make sure that there hasn't been a problem with that, an imbalance. And so there's some testing you can do. If you're using soilless mix, you can have that soilless mix analyzed for nutrients, as well as the actual plant tissue if you want to look for that as well. You can do a comparison between symptomatic leaves and leaves that appear healthy and send those off for nutrient analysis, and maybe you can determine what the problem is with that information as well. Pests and pathogens come from somewhere. We don't have spontaneous generation. And so the next couple of slides shows some of the areas where you may be introducing these problems into your growing system. Anybody that's using potting mix, either to start their transplants or if they're actually growing in potting mix, you want to avoid mixing any kind of field soil in that mix. You don't want that potting mix, which is usually a bark or a peat mix, to come in contact with soil, because the soil contains all kinds of microbes, and the potting mix has a much more restricted repertoire of microorganisms in it. And sometimes when you introduce a pathogen to that mix, the pathogen can sort of take off and give you really significant problems. So it's important to keep things as clean as possible. Proper storage for soilless mixes would be storing on a concrete surface with plastic over the top so it's not exposed to blowing dust from nearby fields or rainwater. And you also have to keep in mind the soil or the potting mix that clings to the containers that you might be using. If there were crops grown in those containers beforehand, like the picture here in the lower right, you can see the potting mix left in there. The microbes, the pathogens, can be carried in that debris as well. And so you don't want to be reusing pots or trays without doing some sort of cleaning before you use them the second time. Other sources of pathogens and pests. Pet plants are notorious for keeping insects and diseases within a greenhouse. People love to bring in their house plants, and the environment is wonderful, but you're also trying to grow a crop. And a lot of insects and even some diseases can survive on that pet plant and get transmitted to the crop that you're trying to produce. So it's really important to keep these kinds of plants away from the crops, so that just eliminates that source of pathogens and insects. The same with plant debris, clean soil, clean plants, benches, surfaces, things like that. You don't want to leave plant debris around so that you can, again, the pathogens and insects are harbored there. And a very important source of insects, arthropods like insects and mites and disease organisms are weeds in your structure. And you can see this picture in the lower right hand side. There's all kinds of chickweed and so forth growing in there, and that's within a greenhouse. And you don't usually treat those plants when you're actually treating your crop. So the insects like thrips and whiteflies can harbor right there in those weeds and then continue to cause problems in the crop. So it's important to keep these things as clean as possible. And weed control inside these structures is very important. Another source of pathogens and pests are the plants that you are introducing to the plants you're going to use as your crop. If you aren't producing your own seedlings, you might buy diseases in with your transplants. And there are some pathogens that are seed transmitted. So you can acquire the problems, the pathogens that are on the seed, and then when you raise the seedlings from that seed, that the pathogens will continue to be there. So it's important to use good certified seed if you can, or be confident in your seed source at being a quality seed source. You can also bring pathogens into your structures, be they greenhouses, warehouses, or whatever, from the landscape around them. And a lot of major commercial greenhouses will have blacktop surfaces around their greenhouse, or at least not have a lot of weed growth around the structures, because those fans will suck in whatever insects and pathogens there might be on the landscape right around the structure. That's important. An important source of insects and diseases in the crop. And we also have issues if you're irrigating with surface water. These are things, irrigation ponds, for example. Again, there's untreated soil in those ponds, and there are certain pathogens that are particularly damaging to hydroponic crops. The water mold pathogens, they used to be called fungi, but they're not anymore. They're called water molds. And there's things like Pythium and Phytophthora that can actually survive in water, in ponds, and if you're using a recirculating system, can recirculate through the entire production facility and really cause a lot of significant damage. So many commercial greenhouse growers who use surface water for irrigation will treat that water first, either through sand filtration, UV treatment. Sometimes they add chlorine type products to it to help manage the microbes that might come into that irrigation water. There are many greenhouse pests that have sort of a broad host range. They occur on many different crops. Two of the most common ones that we see in hydroponic systems, as well as other greenhouse systems, are fungus gnats and shore flies. Fungus gnats actually can damage plants. The larvae there, you can see the picture in the lower left, those whitish larvae with black heads, they can feed on plant roots and get up inside stems and cause some damage and cause collapse. Shore flies tend to not, they aren't really feeding on your crop plants, but they tend to be a nuisance pest. And they produce little black fecal spots, and they fly up and get in people's way when you see them. So these are two things that you need to be aware of when they're happening. When you harvest hydroponic growth, you don't want to be including shore flies in your bag with your hydroponic lettuce, for example. Your customers are not going to be happy with that. But I'm just kind of showing you some pictures of what to look for if you may have these issues in your production facility. We also often see white flies in greenhouses. They are a white fly, and if you brush against plants that have high populations, you'll see this little cloud of white bugs fly off. They have some interesting nymphal stages. They don't look quite like flies. That's the lower picture there on the left. And they can do some significant damage to plants in the greenhouse. The other common insect pest we see in greenhouses are thrips. And the thrips is kind of like a little flying yellow thing. They're most easily seen with hand lens. They're very, very small. But you can see this picture of this lettuce here, the damage that they do sort of a scraping, feeding type injury to the lettuce leaves, and they also have dark fecal spots as well. And clearly that is unattractive. And the other thing about thrips is that they can spread certain viruses, so it's important to keep thrips populations down. We also see arthropods. The mites are not technically insects, they're arthropods. The entomologists in the audience will appreciate me saying that. But the two-spotted spider mites or other spider mites can be a real problem with greenhouses. The picture there is of the adult and then some little translucent round eggs, the picture on the left. And the kind of damage they do can be quite striking when their populations are high. Quite a lot of stippling, little tiny white dots in a normal green leaf that together give you this sort of stippled effect. Broad mites are particularly cryptic. They're very difficult and microscopic to see. But the damage they do, what I've got a picture here, I didn't even get a picture of the adults. I have pictures of eggs, which look like they have white polka dots on them when you're looking at them under the microscope. But the damage they do is more of a distortion kind of damage. And this is a tomato leaf that you can see sort of ruffling on the edges. And sometimes it's a more severe curling. And so that has an impact on yield and on, optimum growth for that particular crop. In the disease category, these are the things caused by microbes. Root rots can be particularly damaging. The symptom here that you see, and this is hydroponic lettuce, the roots are discolored, particularly at the bottom of that plug. A healthy root should be white, and the brown or darker tan roots are the ones that are discolored. And if you touch them, they might pull apart, take all the cortex off, leaving just the vascular cylinder, and that's a rotted root. Now, the symptom that we see in this picture isn't diagnostic for a disease. You can get difficulties with roots and this kind of discoloration and rotting when there's some nutrient imbalances as well. Particularly high soluble salts can cause problems like this. You can't really tell just by eyeballing it. This is where a clinic or having a microscope can help, or doing the nutrient analysis. That can provide information too to help determine whether you're dealing with a nutrient spike, for example, that could have damaged roots. But Pythium root rot is probably the one disease that is most feared in hydroponic systems, because this water mold fungus can swim, and it will swim in the bays, and it will attack the roots and kill the roots, and you can actually kill plants with Pythium. In very severe cases, an entire hydroponic system may have to be taken down and cleaned out because of Pythium issues. And you really need to know where the source is, because you don't want to reintroduce it. So you have to look at your water source and look at other issues, if there's soil that may have been introduced to the system, or if it's coming in on transplants or whatever. So you have to be very, very careful with that one, with Pythium root rot in hydroponic systems. We have some other diseases that are common in all greenhouse systems, and Botrytis Blight, or sometimes called gray mold, is particularly common, a very wide host range. Botrytis is an excellent saprophyte. It lives on all kinds of decaying and senescing plant material. And once it gains entrance to a plant through something like a senescent flower or a wounded area, rough handling of plants, for example, bruising, can allow botrytis to get a hold, and then it will grow into healthier parts of the plant. In the left-hand picture here, you can see the mold that it gives gray mold its name. The spores are kind of grayish in color, and it gets quite fuzzy on the plant material, particularly if it took something and stuck it in like a Ziploc bag with a wet paper towel for overnight. That sporulation will really explode, and you can see it there. We see stem cankers on hydroponic and greenhouse tomato production, often caused by botrytis or gray mold. And then there's this other really kind of interesting problem with gray mold. It's kind of like an inhibited infection where the infection gets started, but it doesn't continue to kill plant tissue. It just gives this weird marking, and it's sometimes called ghost spot. We see it on geraniums. We see it on tomato fruit like this weird kind of marking. So these are things that you should look for if you think you might have a gray mold problem. Some other diseases: powdery mildews and downy mildews. And even though the names are similar, they're very different microorganisms. Powdery mildews are fungi, and they produce a white fluffy growth, usually on the upper leaf surfaces, but sometimes on the undersurface as well. And actually, powdery mildews are unusual fungi in that they don't need wet leaf surfaces to cause infection. They actually do best under conditions of very high humidity. Downy mildews, on the other hand, are more closely related to Pythium. So they're more of an oomycete, a water mold type of pathogen, only they happen to affect the above ground portions of plants. And downy mildews are very host specific. And many powdery mildews are as well. So you're not going to get the same powdery mildew on a cucumber as you would on the tomato or maybe on some of your herb crops. And the same can be said for downy mildews. Basil is notorious for getting downy mildew in both outdoor production and indoor production. And the upper leaf surface with basil downy mildew has sort of a chlorotic look, the yellow kind of blotchiness to the leaves. And when you turn that leaf over, that's where you see the actual downy mildew growth on the undersurface. Downy mildews tend to produce their sporulation on the undersurface of leaves. And in the case of basil downy mildew, it's kind of a dirty grayish black look and fuzzy on the undersurface. Other downy mildews are whiter than that, but the sporulation invariably occurs with downy mildews on the undersurface of the leaves. Let's see if I can. We also have some bacterial diseases that can cause problems in greenhouses. These are often seed associated, and so they will come in on the transplants, whether you grow them yourself or you purchase them. Some growers will do a heat treatment in hot water to their seed prior to planting, and that tends to really reduce the bacteria that might be in or on the seed. Tomato seed in particular, we do hot water treatments for. The pathogens or the disease symptoms that we see with bacterial diseases are usually leaf spot diseases, like the picture here. This is bacterial specks, Pseudomonas syringae, on tomato, and the spots are necrotic. Plus, you get yellow, sometimes yellow halos around the dead areas. But that kind of a spot alone isn't diagnostic, so you do have to be careful when looking at leaf spot symptoms. They're not always going to be bacterial. Some fungi can do similar things, and some viruses, in fact, can do that. The bacterial diseases are usually host specific, and they need wet foliage to continue to cause infection. So they're very difficult to manage. Roguing out plants in the very early stages of symptom development, either ripping off leaves or roguing out the plant itself, is a good way to reduce disease when it's just getting started, to keep things at bay. And then we have virus diseases, and these are less common in greenhouse production, but they do occur, and they can be quite devastating when they do show up. One of the most common diseases we see, virus diseases, is tobacco mosaic virus, which is why we always say that nobody should be using tobacco products in a greenhouse, because this is a very stable virus and it can be introduced to the greenhouse on tobacco products. People smoking cigarettes and handling tomatoes can transmit the virus. It's that stable, and it can give you mosaic and mottle on the foliage, but which may not look so bad, but oftentimes we see problems with the fruit, distortion, uneven ripening, mottling on the fruit, and so it has a real impact on yield. The other group of viruses that we see are the spotted wilt viruses, tomato spotted wilt. And here's some pictures, and you can see how that could easily be mistaken in the foliage symptoms for a bacterial disease or a fungal disease, but it's really viral. And we've got what that can do to the fruit there as well, pretty damaging. So basically, in the last few slides, I've got to talk about managing these problems. And I'll whip through this really quickly, but prevention is the key. If you know where the sources of pathogens and pests are, you use prevention, use sanitation. Some greenhouses will use screening for things like thrips and insects to keep them out. Optimum growing conditions for the crops. A healthy plant is much more able to withstand problems with crops or pests and diseases, I mean. And a weakened plant, because it's not in good growing conditions, will be much more susceptible. You want to use environmental modification to keep leaf surfaces as dry as possible. That might mean increasing ventilation or increasing plant spacing. And there are biological controls you can use for insects and diseases, but they need to be used throughout the crop cycle. It's not something you can use in response to a problem. They sort of have to be there and keep managing and attacking those pests and diseases from the very beginning. You need to monitor what's going on in your greenhouse too. Scouting is incredibly important. And that means really taking a look at what your crops are doing, lifting them out of the hydroponic system, look at the roots, lift them out of pots, look at those roots, look under the leaves, put sticky traps out to attract certain insects like thrips and whiteflies and fungus gnats, some flying insects you will see on sticky cards, and keep a hand lens when you're doing these things. And if you're not sure what you're looking at, consult with specialists. We've got county extension educators, we have state extension specialists, and there are diagnostic laboratories. Every state university's got a plant diagnostic laboratory at their land-grant university. And so, it's not just Maryland, but we all do have these labs that you can take advantage of. And then if necessary, targeted fungicide or insecticide applications. Symptoms can be deceiving, and I've got a couple of slides here to show you that. The picture, both of these pictures of lettuce are showing what could be construed as sort of a tip burn or a collapse of the leaves, but one of them is an infectious disease, Scleroscleretinia Rot, which is actually attacking the roots and the crown of the plant. That's on the left, and the tip burn on the right is due to a nutrient imbalance. So sometimes symptoms can be deceiving and need more investigation. Same with this. On the left, we've got a tomato that has quite distorted growth due to exposure to a growth regulator herbicide. But yet the distortion due to broad mite injury is similar. Similar kinds of twisted growth, stunted growth can look like growth regulator type herbicide. Now, the difference here might be in the pattern. You would expect all the tomato plants that came in contact with the herbicide to show distortion, whereas the mites, being a biotic problem, might start in one spot and kind of slowly move on. So that's where patterns may help you tell the difference. There's a lot you can do with biocontrol of arthropod pests, and if you're really interested in this, I encourage you to contact my colleagues, either Jerry Brust or Stanton Gill, both with UME. with regard to biological control of arthropods. And a lot of our county educators now are entomologists by training as well and have this information. But one thing some greenhouse growers are doing, certainly in ornamentals and could be used in hydroponic food production as well, are the use of banker plants. A banker plant basically allows you to produce your own biocontrol, and it's specific for a particular parasitic wasp that goes after aphids, this one particular aphid, but the parasitic wasp also can feed on other aphids that only feed on grasses. And if you're not growing grasses, you can maintain a small aphid population on those grassy banker plants. And the parasitic wasp can feed on those to get started, then can move out into the crop and attack the green peach aphid that might be affecting your crop. So it's a neat system. And we also have biofungicides that are good for plant diseases. Again, they won't stop a raging epidemic, but they can be part of an overall IPM plan with some of your crops that are being grown in controlled environments like greenhouses or warehouses. And resources for growers here, you can get a lot of information if you're growing vegetables from the publication EB236. It can be downloaded from the Maryland vegetables website. If you just Google Maryland vegetables, I think you'll find that website, and there's a link there to the publication. And a consortium of universities have put together a resource called Electronic Grower Resources Online, or eGrow. And there's a lot of really good information on ornamentals and edible crops grown within structures. And if you just Google egrow.org, you'll find it. And I got a lot of information just when I was preparing this talk from the bulletins in eGrow. And it's a great resource for anybody using controlled environment agriculture. And finally, this is my contact info. If you've got problems, I'll happy to look at images, happy to look at samples. It's just when field observations aren't enough and you just need that extra testing. And that's what the University of Maryland Plant Diagnostic Lab does. And you can get this information also. We have a website, just again, Google University of Maryland Plant Diagnostic Lab, and you'll find it. And with that, my presentation is finished, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate it. You did an excellent job, and I always learn about a new insect or disease that I was not familiar with that I need to keep an eye out when I listen to your presentations. Thank you. I do just want to mention for the participants, there are a lot of growers, urban farmers who grow outdoors, and there are some urban farmers who grow indoors, and I wanted to make sure that today's sessions had a nice mix of topics relevant to whether you're growing outdoors or indoors. So this session was focused for indoor growers, but I do think the outdoor growers might have some things to learn from it too. A lot of those diseases you might find outdoors as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So if anyone has questions, if you could type them in the chat. There are a lot of us, so we might not have time for people to unmute and talk too much, but we will then spend some time networking after this. So does anyone have questions they wanted to ask? And I don't actually see any questions in the chat yet. Okay. So if someone wants to unmute and ask a question rather than taking the time to type it up, we can do that.
Yes, I actually have a question. My name is Kareem Masaraway, and I am a hydroponic grower, and I just wanted to know, do you have any recommendations for any biofungicides? I know you listed some in your presentation, but like from your personal experience, those that you find more effective or even just safer to use for plant produce?
The biofungicides in and of themselves are safe to use. The ones I listed, and there's are registered for greenhouse use on edible crops. So that is useful. Okay. There's still, most of them will be used as a foliar spray if there was a problem, as opposed to being put into a hydroponic medium. And I don't have personal experience with their efficacy in hydroponic media. And there's a lot of research on that, or there's a lot of questions about it, and the research there's less research actually on it. So, and we sometimes get equivocal results in the research with these biofungicides. And there are many different factors that would explain it, that are specific to a particular system. There might be just some variability in temperature or distribution, or the particular pest involved or disease involved, those kinds of things. So I wish I could have a big blanket. The blanket statement for the biofungicides is that you cannot wait. They will not be very effective in controlling a major outbreak. So they are more preventative, or just the occasional use to kind of keep the pathogen levels low in general. And that's one overall thing I can describe. The vendors for some of those will also have some good information to use. So if you're looking online at some of the vendors, they've got some trials that have been posted too.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And Alan has a quick question about whether the diagnostic lab tests irrigation water for pathogens.
That's a good question, Alan, and we have not been set up to do that. And partly it's so much of that testing depends on how you take the sample. It's, you know, you don't just go in and it's like a needle in a haystack trying to test a quart of liquid for pathogens that may be distributed in a very large reservoir of liquid. So we're not set up to do that, but there are labs who do. And there are some private laboratories that will do that, and there's some centrifugation involved. And I'll see if I can come up with, off the top of my head, some, I can't do that right now. Names escape me right now, but there are some private labs that will do that.
Thank you. And I did put, Tennessee has a great guide on irrigation water quality that I put a link to in the chat as well, for testing for all kinds of things.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
Sure.